Good evening and welcome to another Lee Rust Art Studio live stream. Tonight we are going to be looking at waterfalls. This weekend's workshop is all about getting there and painting and drawing waterfalls. One of my favourite subjects. Always a wealth of inspiration working on scenes like this. So tonight we're just going to tackle a small canvas and have a look at how we can compose from photo reference to get a better flow and composition along the way. Thanks for joining me. If you're tuning in, we are just about to get ourselves started. Just got to share it across to a few spots and then we're good to go. So, as usual, we have our Sunday workshop happening this weekend, and I'll be running you through the ways that I work on scenes like what I'm about to paint tonight. Along the way, I'll share some tips and tricks on how I get there and work on these scenes to get the most out of them, and give you guidance as you hopefully are working along with me. So to get us started, I'm just mixing up a little bit of dioxazine violet with some burnt sienna. Have my photo reference and it's just vanished on me. We'll just jump straight in. Right. So I've just sketched out the scene really quickly with a graphite pencil onto my panel here. Essentially what we're going to have is a whole heap of rocks framing the scene. Just working with this muted violet mix in a wash to get a bit of a cover on the panel. Those of you who have been watching my demos lately know that I generally tend to work on a coloured ground. Tonight I figured for a little study we'll just get there and use an existing little canvas panel, but I will get there and run in an undercolour to get us going. My screen's doing a weird thing. Is everyone getting this as a full size? Just shoot me a comment in the comment section if you can and let me know. Otherwise I'll restart the whole process, because all I'm seeing in my screen is a tiny little thumbnail. Really hope that's not what you're getting tonight. So for me, moving into painting and drawing waterfalls was a pretty logical sort of step through from where we were last week as we started looking at rivers and reflections. Rivers and reflections give you a good base to sort of get started on this. It's not crucial, but it certainly helps to have that foundation to guide you through. Just throwing a tiny bit of ultramarine into the mix now. This will dirty it up and cool it down so I can start blocking in some of the shadows. I love painting rocks. They're one of my favourite things to work with. Just so much variety that you can play with. But funnily enough, they're one of those things that my students are forever getting there and finding quite challenging. So I thought this was the perfect time to get there and break it down. So obviously I'm just roughing in some lights and darks. This purple undertone is literally just going to be to set everything up. And then as we get stuck into the actual piece, a lot of these colours will still poke through and show through the surface, but they're just there to get us going. So at this early stage, you should be able to see roughly what's happening with our composition. The water comes down, we've got some rocks sort of wedged against one another here. Our water's flowing down the back of these and then coming through. So we're just looking at a little runoff at the base of the waterfall here. I'm just working in acrylic for anyone that was wondering, but the same process can be done with oils as well. If I'm working in pastel, I normally go through and do a block in along the same sort of line, but obviously having a coloured base underneath me as well, which will change everything quite dramatically. Just bringing a touch of lemon yellow into that same violet mix now. And this colour is going to be brought through quite a bit as our next pass, especially through the shadows. It works really well to get some warmth into these shadow areas. So this stage is really just about getting the basic shapes blocked in, not necessarily the final shapes, but just feeling out the composition a little bit. Not too stressed about the white water at the moment. I'm actually going to get there and just use a very thinned down version of this brown mix that I've got here, so we don't have too much white really showing through. Obviously the water's crashing through. We're going to have a lot of splash through here, and then we start to work our way out. Just prop that up there for the moment. Hopefully it doesn't fall down as I work this bottom corner. Sometimes working on a canvas is a benefit, and other times it can be a real pain. But we'll just make it work tonight, it'll be fine. Oh, nearly ran away. That's what I was waiting for. Alright, so our next point, now that we've got all of our base colours pretty much blocked in, is separating the areas and getting a sense of where our background and our foreground come into play. Bear with me for one moment as I locate my errant reference photo that ran away just before I started the stream. For those of you who are interested, that is what I'm using as my reference tonight. So using it for concept more than anything else, and then just shifting everything according to what I'm looking for in the scene. Your reference doesn't have to be the finish. In a lot of cases, it'll just give you a guide point to get yourself going. There's a lot of very interesting colours to be worked through these rocks. So I'm just starting by greying off some of our foreground stuff here. As I want the focus to draw through into the main part of the scene. Going to work with a single brush on this for as long as possible. So the whole point of bringing in the bright colours first is just to get a bit of undercolour that can punch through the top layers and influence the colours you put on top. A lot of this stuff will be done using a combination of glazes, which is what I'm doing here, just very thin paint washed over the existing areas as we go. And then some more impasto sort of techniques built on top of that as well. So generally my process is that I'll work with very thin darks first and then start building up into the lights and gradually increase the body of them as we go. Just going to throw a little bit of white into our foreground here. This just has a touch of the violet brought in along with some of the other murkier colours so that it's not too clean. When you're working with white, try and avoid for as long as you possibly can just using white as it is. If you can work it into the other ranges first, playing with substitute whites, it means when you do bring the true white through, it's going to have a lot more impact and really make a statement. If you bring it in too early, too hard, it can overpower everything and take away from what should be an impact point. If you have any questions while I'm working, feel free to ask. In the meantime, I will continue to just tell you about what I'm approaching on this work, what techniques I'm working with. This particular scene is actually down in Tassie. This is at the base of St. Columba Falls in Pyangana. Absolutely magnificent spot for anyone that can get down that way. Although it'd be very, very frosty at the moment. Believe me, I'd rather be there at the moment than where I am, but these are the crazy times we're living in, aren't they? So I want to get a bit of separation from foreground to background, which is why I'm introducing some touches of highlights against some of these rocks. They won't be the finishes, but it'll help us get a bit more variety in here. Into some of these browns and greys, I want to pink them up a little bit. That was the whole reason for bringing the violet through first. With a lot of these little wet rocks, they have got this slight sort of pink hue to them. I just want to lift that up gently as we move through some of these spaces. One of the big challenges with painting waterfalls like this is that you're dealing with wet rocks, so that you're going to have a lot of reflected surfaces here too. Makes things very interesting in the way you approach them. Just bear with me, I'm making sure that the video isn't being stupid and just going at a ridiculously small size here. Hopefully the internet holds out and continues to do what it needs to here. If there's any dramas, please let me know. On my side, it's not really giving me any feedback. So just going through with this little pink mauve mix. This is just going to sort of suggest some of the light forms before we bring in the real strong highlights. Just lifting little touches of the burnt sienna back into the mix as well. So this rock that I'm working on here is going to cop the most light. There's a lot of water sort of cascading down and creating a very wet surface here. Using some broken marks on that just to get a little bit of variety. Switch across to a smaller brush in a moment, but as I said, we'll continue with this for a little bit longer. And see if we can get the majority of our big shapes in and then start to evolve them as we go. When you're painting waterfalls, it doesn't necessarily have to be the main fall that you're looking at. Little outcrops like this, little streams and rivulets running through, can be a lot of fun and very, very interesting subjects to handle. Now the sections are starting to separate a little bit more, which is what I was after. We'll run a few more little lights in and then switch across and start bringing in some more darks and breaking up some of these rock forms a little bit. Just want to blue off that water ever so slightly. So it's actually going to come through as a muted blue-grey first, that we can then build our highlights on top of. Now, one of the main reasons why I work so thinly on my base layers is that they're going to dry nice and quick. It'll give me a chance to build over the top of them easily. I find just that freedom of being able to rough in marks, not stressing too much about the colour, but more just building some textures and playing with it. It's one of the real fun parts of doing scenes like this. First and foremost, you need to be having fun with your work. If you can get it to that point, everything else will come. Alright, so now I'm just going to bring in a little bit more dark. Again, just working with the ultramarine and burnt sienna to anchor these rocks in. Going to be a lot more light on this one, bringing us forward a little bit more too. My palette tonight's pretty much my primary colour palette, but I have introduced the violet and the burnt sienna into the mix, just as convenience colours more than anything else. Little dry brushed marks can do a lot of the work for you here too. So don't feel that you have to paint every single detail consistently. In a lot of cases you'll find that less is more with this. Just a gentle touch can really make a huge difference to lifting a section out. Like you can see how much impact just roughing in some of this burnt sienna is making to some of the rocks here, giving us a completely different colour cast to what we started with. And that was the reason why I wanted to work the undertone first, so that as we lift in through these sections, we can really play with those variations a lot more. Over the top of the brown, the pink mauve can come in and grey it off. How's that looking on screen? Obviously I'm seeing it from a different angle to you guys. Hoping that it's reading alright. Just switching brushes now, we're going to start bringing in some slightly smaller marks. I haven't gone down too much size-wise. Just going from a 12 down to about an 8. So, literally from one to the other. I do prefer working with a flat in a lot of cases for stuff like this. Just a personal thing. Personally, if it's an old worn brush, it will generally behave better for me than what a new pristine brush will do. It's quite silly, but it has a lot to do with how I approach my paint and the way that I work. I like that roughness to help pull things together. It's going to rough in a little bit of work on the water here. Using white, but just using it very, very gently here. I don't want to overdo anything yet. There's a lot of work ahead of us yet. But I want to see if we can start getting some movement and just bringing these layers up to where they need to be before we get too much further through. So now just bringing in some stronger marks of light that I can start manipulating. We start to get different levels on the rocks now. We have got water streaming down through this area, but I don't need to push it too much. Just a little touch is enough to help get us set up there. We do have a little runoff just in this corner, which I want to utilise because it's going to help give us a bit of contrast here. That was the whole idea of having this big rock to anchor this side. And sort of play with some of these forms and get some crispness in this edge. Going to flick in. Paint's still a bit on the thick side. It's pretty early to be doing it, but I'm going to get there and flick in some little texture splatters too. They're a really fun thing to do to loosen up the work a little bit. A lot of this will get covered anyway, but I'd just like to get that in at a reasonably early point to help make life a little bit easier and bring in a bit more texture. Also just have some fun with it. Find when painting rocks, it's just a matter of looking at the contours and the shapes. Picking up those hard edges first, getting the big forms in. Try and think about it like a sculptor rather than a painter. So all you want to do, you want to get those big planes in first, and then you can refine it. If you treat it that way, they're actually really, really easy to do. Just going to turn the canvas around a little bit so you should get a better view. Just let me make a few little readjustments here. The angle should be a bit better. Poor old webcam is struggling a little bit to control the image though, so just bear with me while I see if we can get us back to where we need to be. Come on. We'll just keep building through from there. Trying to get my exposure to the right level so that it looks closer to what I'm dealing with in front of you. That looks a bit better. Alright. We'll get stuck back in. Remember, if you're watching, feel free to ask questions. That's what I'm here for. Alright, so most of the forms are starting to come together pretty quickly here. Quite happy with that as a block-in. Gives us a good base to build on now. Now the time is approaching to start bringing in a bit more texture and really playing with our lights and darks. I'm going to work off to one side of my canvas here, so you should get a better view for the rest of this little demo. Next up, I'm just bringing in a really rich dark. So with my rich dark, I do use black. Don't use it a lot, but it is on my palette. But the way that I get more out of it is I actually mix colours into it rather than just bringing the black in on its own. And with this, we need some really good rich darks to play off here. So that's precisely what we're about to do. I'm actually going to sharpen up this rock in the foreground first. This dark mix that I've used is a combo of lamp black. I've dropped some violet and magenta into it, and then come back in with a little bit of the burnt sienna. Being used very thinly, but it's a very rich dark which will give us a lot of sharpness in this foreground. Which immediately will push a lot of our background stuff back to where it needs to go. Going to work some little runoffs nearby. And we're going to start pushing the green range next. A lot of moss on the base of some of these rocks. So to get us going with that, taking that same deep mix that I've just had and dropping a tiny bit of our lemon yellow into it. That same mix can be worked through the face of this big rock. Carve in some little reflected lights. You don't want it too dark. You need to be able to see into that surface. I can grey it back as well. It's actually quite an effective grey because it's got that pinky brown undertone to it. Pretty much back to what the original pass was here. But I can now start using it for finer details and textures. You can see immediately this rock's really starting to pop out a lot more now. And everything that looked dark in the first pass is now sitting back quite dramatically by comparison. This is why I like to build up through my layers in this fashion. It's a really effective way to control your values and get these forms to sit where you want them to be. At the moment we're still going to just keep concentrating on our rock forms. And then we'll start bringing in the moss and extra textures and details as we get a bit further through. See, because I work thinly, I can get there and drag through touches of dark back over the top of a light coat without turning it completely to muck. Brush pressure is a really handy thing to concentrate on when you're working. How lightly or how heavily you push your brush against your surface will impact on how it blends, whether it plays for you or whether it fights you. If you're finding that when you go to lay down a colour and it's really not playing at all, it's generally because your brush pressure is wrong. So experiment with the consistency of your paint. In a lot of cases, the lightest touch on the brush can produce that look that you may be searching for, that you're struggling to get. Same actually applies for pretty much all mediums too. Pastel in particular, you want a mark to influence everything else. Hit it hard. You want it to blend in. Work gently. So those rocks are starting to come into their own now in the foreground. The darks can continue to be built, but we're in the right zone there now. Just going to push them back with a slab of another rock in here too. Just tying us to that foreground a little bit more. And starting to play on some of these forms here. While it's not crucial, I do like to try and work through a lot of different areas while I've got a particular colour on the go to tie things together. It just helps get a bit of continuity going. I'm going to work a little bit more in here. Bringing in some dark, but not going as dark as what we've got on the other side. Yeah, you're going to still go a bit deeper. Just want to anchor some darker marks on the side of here where we've got that water cascading down. Just gives us a bit of contrast. The whole idea is we want our eye to lock in on the flow of the water and then explore all the rock forms as we go back through. So by starting with that really warm sort of purple base first, and then just building the shadows back up gently, it allows us to create more contrast on where we want the eye to focus. Start to separate these areas up a little bit more. I'm feeling the flow's working pretty well here. Don't want to deepen some of this stuff a little bit more. I don't want that path from the water to be completely in your face. Just want to push this back into the shadows a little bit more. Back so I can get a better idea as to how it's all coming together. Yeah, heading in the right direction. The darks on the front rock here are probably a little bit on the strong side. That's okay at this early stage. we're going to start playing with some of our mid-tones next. Coming in quite boldly next. When I say boldly, just introducing some very vibrant colour by comparison to what we've had so far. So what I'm introducing here is a lighter mix that's just got a tiny bit of the burnt sienna and the magenta in it. Makes for some very interesting mid-tones. We can use it to break up a lot of these shapes. And it's that warm sort of coppery colour that is working in under a lot of the rock form. While it's not always going to be dominant, it is poking through in a lot of these shapes. Especially before we come through on the lights. A lot of the lights in this picture are actually quite cool. So we really got that blue top coat coming in on it. So having these little warm notes poking through in the darks and the midtones are going to contrast quite nicely with that. At this stage, it's just pushing and pulling your lights and darks around. Remember, constantly step back, evaluate it from a distance. If you're always up close to the work, it's very easy to get bogged down by the details and you end up missing what you're aiming for. To just mix up a really pale blue-grey. This is going to go in and clash against some of the stuff we've already got there. It needs to have a slight pink undertone to it, but it's only an undertone. I'm just going to scumble it in gently first and make sure the levels are where I want them to be before we push on too far. I'm going to start over on this far rock. Just grabbing some little edges. that's going to work nicely for the light. Just gives, as I said, cool top coat on it, which helps with that reflected up, that idea of the wet rocks and the reflections. Just little flicks here and there will do a lot of the work for us. This is one of those subjects where you can really go to town with detail, but it's not necessary. You pretty much take it where you want to go. So not always crucial to work every edge, because at the end of the day you're only going to need to do that on parts of it, not everywhere. I do want to refine a little bit of this big rock. There's quite a bit of interesting lighting coming across this. I do apologise if you can hear my kids. I'm about to go remind them very, very nicely to behave. They're doing pretty well, all things considered, with this lockdown. Alright, and we're back. Apologies for that interruption. So on some of these rocks we're just going to play with contrasts of warms and cools about the same value. I may have to leave again in a moment to go and kill a couple of kids, but hopefully it won't take too long to bury them. Kidding, obviously. Lightening off that big rock has made a huge difference to the composition. Really starting to bring things into play now. And the light that I'm working with here is very thin. You don't need to overdo it. Quite a thin mix can be very, very effective just to sit on the surface and highlight the areas you need them to. As far as a study goes, I think we're almost where we need to be for this one. Going to work some of the edges on our foreground. Yep. Lift sections out a bit more. Coming back in with touches of that warmer pink based light that I had earlier. Browning it off, I'm just mixing it into my dark mix as well. And that could be used to break up some of this foreground section. Yeah, this is acrylic. Just a fun little study for the night. Sorry mate, the rapid fire messages came through and I couldn't keep on top of it. Ah, thank you. Glad you like it. Waterfalls are always a favourite thing to paint. You can do so much with them. I'm going to bring in some little touches of moss now. Which will pretty much start to shift the dynamic of the whole picture very quickly. Using violet instead of the blue in a lot of cases to create this green that I'm working with. Still got ultramarine in there, but it's more just focusing on the other side of the spectrum. You can see it's still quite thin because it's washing over some of these rocks. Yeah, I've used the burnt sienna as an undertone to set up a lot of the water. And then I bring the more golden overtones on top to finish it off. Just going to deepen some of our shadows here in the foreground. Same as what we did on the big rock here, I just want it to separate and lift us forward. Can even start throwing a bit more deeper shadow over some of these. So we can help control the eye and pull us back into where we want our real focus to be. Just introducing some darker touches in against some of the moss. Yeah, some of the rocks I'll be working darks first and then glazing my colour over the top to help get them sitting in the surface. So to set up those darks in our water here, I'm just coming in with the same mix I used through my rocks earlier. One of the early dark mixes where I was running through with the ultramarine and burnt sienna. We can just use that to rough in some little forms in here. That same colour that I worked through with the moss can be worked through the foreground here too. That's exactly the mix I'm actually working with. Just helps give a bit more contrast against my white sections. Going to go a stiffer brush on this. Still keeping with a reasonably large brush for the canvas. But it's time to get some edges in now. Going to start by hitting the top of where the water's cascading down. Not everywhere, just the spots where we want a bit more play and contrast. Splatter is a little bit on the thick side. Just getting a bit of splash happening here. Thanks, mate. The movement's really what it's all about, isn't it? Movement and light. With a scene like this, movement's paramount. These paint splatters are always a fun little touch just to get things moving in the right direction. You can use the back of the brush and carve through and manipulate some of the marks as you need to too. That'd be great, I'd like to see it. Going to do a few little touches up here. Couple of little flicks and we're pretty much done on this piece. Yep, I'm calling that for tonight. Not a bad way to spend just over an hour. Thanks for joining me. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll catch you again soon.